David stepped off his private jet and felt the bitter wind whip across the small, half-deserted airfield. The trip had been successful so far, or at least he had signed a massive deal that would benefit his company for years to come. His chauffeur stood by the car, waiting for him to climb inside. David nodded curtly as he entered, expecting a smooth ride to a local hotel. But no sooner had they pulled away from the runway than dark clouds covered the sky, and the wind began to howl. Snow started falling in heavy sheets, making it difficult to see the road ahead. Normally, David would have brushed off a little snow. He had faced far greater challenges in his life and had emerged stronger from nearly every ordeal. He had grown his technology empire from nothing, taught himself business strategies when he was still in college, and befriended some of the most influential people in the world. A snowstorm should have been a minor nuisance. But this storm grew fiercer by the minute, and his usual calm confidence wavered when he heard the storm warnings on the radio. His driver's voice cracked with worry, urging David to find shelter as soon as possible. The roads were becoming slick with ice, and the whirling snow created a wall of white. David authorized him to leave the main highway in search of somewhere warm and safe to wait out the weather. After driving slowly for another half-hour, they spotted a small roadside diner with a few flickering lights. It seemed a welcoming haven against the harsh storm outside. When David stepped from the car, the crunch of snow under his polished shoes felt surreal. He hadn't used them in such conditions before. He tugged his thick coat closer around himself, barely able to see his driver through the swirling snow. The sign for the diner swayed under the gusts, its neon tubes sputtering in protest. David could only imagine how remote this place must be. He felt a shiver of unease, but also a surprising tingle of anticipation. There was something different in the air, a sense that more than just business was about to unfold. Pushing the door open, he entered the diner. It was warm, a welcoming roast of scents, brewed coffee, freshly baked bread, and a hint of cinnamon. The light inside was dim and comforting, a sharp contrast to the wild storm raging outdoors. A young woman behind the counter gave him a hesitant smile. She was sweet-looking, perhaps in her mid-20s, wearing a simple apron. She must have seen the wind's fury in his eyes. She gestured toward an empty booth. David nodded and made his way there, brushing off clumps of snow from his coat. He placed his order, a hot cup of coffee and a grilled sandwich, and settled into the booth. As he waited, he gazed around the small diner. The walls were adorned with old pictures of the countryside. Several travelers sat scattered among the tables, most with anxious expressions. They were all stuck, just like him, waiting for the storm to calm. He felt strangely at peace, though. No urgent phone calls, no board members to please, just the hush of snow and the warmth of this small place in the middle of nowhere. Halfway through his meal, a gust of wind blew the door open again. He glanced over, and that was when he saw her. She slipped inside with her arms full of groceries, trying to keep the snow from blowing in behind her. He couldn't see her face at first as she bent over to place the bags on a table. Then she turned around. The sight made David's heart skip a beat. He recognized her immediately. Emily. He had not seen her in years. The sudden flood of memories took him by surprise. For a moment, David sat there, stunned, uncertain if he should say hello. He remembered their brief relationship from a time when he traveled across the country, exploring various business opportunities. She had been kind, intelligent, and had a quiet strength that drew him in. But life had moved fast back then, and he had left in pursuit of bigger investments and expansions. He remembered promising to keep in touch, but he never had. The demands of his business and the unstoppable march of success had swept him away. He was almost afraid to speak, not sure how she would react. After all, he had disappeared from her life without explanation. He raised his coffee cup to his lips, feeling the warmth meet his cold fingertips. He wondered if she had changed much. From his vantage point, she seemed the same, still slender, with gentle eyes. But there was a quiet weariness around her now. Her hair was pinned back in a simple bun rather than the free-flowing waves he recalled. And though she wore a determined expression, he thought he saw a hint of sadness when she turned to glance out at the storm. Minutes passed before Emily happened to look his way. At first, she did not register who he was. Then her eyes went wide, and David forced a small smile. She hesitated, then nodded in greeting. He stood and walked over, feeling the slight tremble in his steps. As he approached, he had no idea what to say. He murmured an unsteady hello, his voice quieter than he intended. She looked him up and down, as if verifying what she saw. Finally, she breathed his name. The intensity of the moment weighed on them both, and it seemed like the whole diner paused as they stood face to face. David stammered a question, something about how she was, though his mind was whirling in a dozen directions. Emily didn't reply immediately, but finally managed a kind of polite greeting. They were mere feet apart, but there was a canyon of time, regret, and unspoken questions between them. He noticed her expression held no anger, only cautious curiosity, maybe a little pain. David felt a twinge of guilt. He offered to buy her a coffee, using the same uncertain tone he had when they were younger and nervous about admitting how they felt. Emily said she was fine, though she did not resist when David waved the waitress over to bring another cup and a pot of coffee. She sat at a small table near the window, the storm behind her a constant swirl of white. David settled across from her, clasping his hands together to steady them, and he asked how she had been, what she was doing in this part of the country. Emily explained that she had moved here a few years ago, after a series of changes in her life. She kept details sparse, maybe not wanting to share everything with him. David assured her he wasn't prying, but he wanted to know. His eyes darted to her left hand. He noticed not a marital ring, but a simple silver band. He felt a strange sense of relief and also confusion. Why was she alone? Did she move here for work? He did not have the right to ask these questions, but he could not help feeling protective. The conversation turned awkward. David apologized for leaving so suddenly years ago and confessed how his company had demanded every ounce of his attention. Emily nodded, though her face showed no judgment. Instead, she simply listened, which seemed to unsettle him more. He realized he'd come face to face with the one person he had once truly respected. Their connection had felt pure, free from business agendas and corporate power. Now, with the snow rushing outside, it was as if time stood still, forcing him to face the past he'd ignored. Eventually, Emily touched his hand gently, as though she recognized the conflict in him. She suggested they talk elsewhere. The diner was crowded, and the storm was intensifying outside, with gusts rattling the windows. David hesitated. His driver was still at the counter, probably coordinating with a local authority or trying to find a better hotel. But David stood up, pulled his coat around him, and followed Emily outside. She led him to a small pickup truck loaded with supplies. David offered to drive, but she insisted she knew the roads better. They set off slowly, the truck's heater barely keeping the cold at bay, but Emily navigated confidently. Even though visibility was poor, she knew every twist of the road. This place was obviously home for her. David found himself studying her face in the glow of the dashboard lights. The lines he saw were signs of responsibility and worry. It made him feel both concerned and strangely proud of the strong woman she had become. At last, they reached a small cabin nestled among tall pine trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Emily parked the truck and gestured for David to follow her in. The wind howled fiercely, flinging snow across the porch. David rushed forward, still not certain why Emily had decided to bring him here. Yet he felt an odd closeness, as if some part of his heart recognized that this was exactly where he needed to be. Entering the cabin, he was greeted by a gentle heat from the fireplace. The living area was cozy. Rugs lay on the wooden floor, furniture was sparse but homey, and pictures lined the walls. Emily dropped her keys on a small table by the door. David removed his coat, scanning the room. Beside the fireplace lay a stack of children's books, colorful covers with playful characters. He felt his heart flutter. Emily noticed his gaze. A quiet step sounded behind them. David turned and saw 3 small figures peering from a hallway. Their eyes were wide, and each child carried a toy. The oldest girl, maybe 5 or 6, clutched a small doll. Beside her stood a boy of similar age, holding a toy truck, his expression protective. And last, a younger girl with big, curious eyes clung to what looked like a worn teddy bear. The trio hovered, uncertain. Emily's posture changed. She moved toward the children, placing a reassuring hand on the oldest girl's shoulder. She introduced them quietly, Lily, Logan, and Loveth. The three children stared at David. He couldn't keep the surprise from his face. He attempted a smile, but his heart thumped in his chest. How could Emily have 3 children of this age? Had it really been that many years since they'd last seen each other? He did the quick math in his head. His eyes roamed from one child to the other, taking in their features. He spotted shadows of himself in their faces, something in their eyes, a hue of hair color, a shape of a cheek. He looked away, overwhelmed. Emily watched, clearly struggling for words. She knelt down to the children, whispering that David was an old friend. They nodded politely, though their curiosity stayed sharp. David stood rooted, too shocked to speak. He turned to Emily, meeting her gaze. The accusation ran through his mind. Why didn't you tell me? But he saw the complexity in her eyes. When she finally sat down on the couch, he followed, sinking into the warm cushions. The triplets went back to the hallway, but they stood close, eavesdropping. Emily explained calmly, her tone wrapped in regret. She had found out she was pregnant shortly after David left. She tried to reach him but received replies only from his busy staff or found that his number had changed. Eventually, she decided to move forward alone. David's chest felt heavy. Not only had he been absent from these children's upbringing, he had also stolen from himself the chance to know them. In that moment, all the power and money he had seemed meaningless. He was at a loss, struggling to find words. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke about her first months of pregnancy, the fear she felt, and how she had to rely on herself. She had moved to this quiet part of the country to give her children a stable environment. Space and time suddenly seemed thin. David spoke slowly, trying to convey his sincerity. He never meant to abandon her or any potential children. Before his departure all those years ago, he never imagined she might become pregnant. The two had parted on cordial terms, promising one day to reconnect, but life moved too quickly. David explained how he lost touch with some close friends during the expansion of his empire. He realized the absolute failure on his part to keep in contact, to check in on her, to wonder if their brief relationship left a lasting effect. Emily's eyes were moist. He was uncertain whether it was sorrow, relief, or a mixture of both. She admitted she had long hoped for a chance to let him know about Lily, Logan, and Loveth, but as more time passed, she felt it would be disruptive to their lives. The children now had their routine, friends, and a settled life. She feared David's wealth and all the media attention that came with it might upset their small-town privacy. David found himself humbler than ever. He gently asked permission to speak with the children. Emily nodded, so he rose and walked toward the hallway. The three stood there, biting their lips, holding tightly onto their toys. David knelt down and introduced himself again, a little uncertain. He told them he was a friend of their mother's. Lily seemed the bravest, stepping forward. She asked if the storm was really bad. He replied that it was, but they were safe now. Logan asked if he had seen trucks bigger than his toy model. David laughed softly and answered that he owned entire fleets of trucks for business. Loveth, the youngest girl, remained quiet. She only stared at him, turning her teddy bear in her arms. David's heart ached. He recognized in her eyes a reflection of his own caution and curiosity. He guessed she was uncertain whether he was a good person, or if he might disrupt their close-knit family. He assured her softly that he liked teddy bears, too, and that hers looked very brave. She glanced away, shy, but a small smile curved her lips. Over the next few hours, as wind and snow battered the cabin, David tried to learn more about his children. Emily prepared a simple meal, and the children laughed as David made silly faces and told them about all the unusual places he had traveled to. They asked if he had ridden on a spaceship or if he had swum with sharks. Stories of his actual business ventures weren't as interesting as mythical adventures, so he spun them a few playful tales that sent them into bursts of giggles. A warmth grew within him. This was real life, messy, unexpected, but deeply meaningful. He understood that all his achievements, from the skyscrapers to the fancy apartments, had never filled the emptiness inside. He realized that was what had drawn him to Emily in the first place. All those years ago, she sprung from a simpler, more genuine world. A world where people cared about one another beyond mere profit or power. As the evening deepened, the wind howled louder, and the windows trembled with the weight of the storm. Outside, snow continued to accumulate in thick drifts. There was no question that David was staying the night. The roads were impassable. Emily made up a spare bed in the small room adjacent to the children's. David offered to help with chores, like bringing more firewood from outside. He nearly lost his footing at least 3 times in the swirling snow, but he succeeded. His designer coat got soaked, but he found himself laughing. Later, as the children went to bed, Emily lingered with David near the dying fire. She looked worried, as if trying to measure whether she could trust him. David assured her again he had no intention of making her life harder. He did, however, feel it was his duty to be present for the children now that he knew they existed. Emily seemed both hopeful and cautious. She confessed that the children had wondered about their father. She had told them little, only that he was far away. David swallowed hard, fighting guilt. He promised he would do his best to earn their trust. For hours, they talked, their voices low, the fire casting flickers on the cabin walls. David opened up about his wealth and power, describing how at first it was exciting, yet eventually it consumed him. He felt hollow, constantly chasing the next big deal. Emily listened in silence, her eyes alight with a compassion he hardly felt he deserved. She said that what mattered now was how he chose to move forward. They shared stories of their youth, how they met at a conference, how they enjoyed each other's company, and how neither imagined that a short fling would lead to something so profound. Now, with time past, they realized those days had been a crossroad. In that quiet moment, they both recognized they might have taken a different path if given another chance. Yet, as the storm raged, perhaps fate was finally providing them an unexpected chance to address the past and reshape the future. The night rolled on. Eventually, Emily stood and said she needed to rest. She paused in front of David. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, searching his eyes for sincerity or perhaps an apology. He gave a small nod. At last, she left for her bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar in case the children called. David sat in the hushed glow of the embers. Storm or not, sleep would not come easily for him. The realization that he was a father to 3 beautiful children filled him with both joy and trepidation. In the morning, the snow had not abated. The entire landscape was buried under drifts, the trees sagging from the sheer weight. David woke to the smell of pancakes and bacon. He emerged from the guest room in some borrowed clothes. Emily and the children were already eating. Lily and Logan rushed to show him the small Christmas tree they had decorated. Loveth shyly held out a handmade ornament, a paper star, inviting him to place it on the highest branch. David smiled at the delight shining in their eyes. Wrapped in this strange, cozy existence, David felt a longing that was new and powerful. He wanted more days like this. He wanted to guide his children as they navigated life, a life he had never considered before. After breakfast, while the children played in the corner, Emily suggested that David might want to phone his driver to confirm he was all right. David had forgotten all about it. Indeed, he found messages on his phone once he managed to connect with a patchy signal. His driver had ended up at a motel for the night, safe but worried. David told him he was staying at a friend's cabin. He promised they would reconnect once the roads cleared. But inside, David wrestled with a deep question. What comes next? Did he invite Emily and the children back with him to the city? Did he move here to stay near them? Could he juggle fatherhood and the intense demands of his empire? And what would this mean for Emily, who had built a quiet life of her own? The hours of the second day passed in a swirl of snow and reflection. David helped the children color pictures, and they showed him their favorite board games. Emily explained how life in the cabin worked. They had a small generator for backup, a well behind the property, and a small garden in the kinder seasons. David found it refreshing, almost healing, to realize that happiness could exist outside of almighty wealth. That night, David and Emily quietly talked in the kitchen while the children slept. The tension was obvious. He wanted to be in their lives. She admitted she had been doing fine on her own, but the triplets needed a father's guiding hand. Yet she was worried he might place his business first again, and the children would end up hurt. David could not blame her caution. He reassured her he had evolved. The stony businessman's armor had cracks now, enough to let the light of fatherhood and genuine love through. In the early hours of the morning, the storm finally began to subside. The forecast suggested that by midday, plows would clear the main roads. David's heart fluttered with uncertainty. Should he leave? Could he stay longer, perhaps help shovel the snow from Emily's driveway, do small tasks to prove himself? He yearned to uphold any promise he made. Yet, he was conscious his empire never waited. He had a board meeting soon that involved major international partners. Emily saw the worry in his eyes. She took a step back, giving him space to sort out his thoughts. When Lily and Logan woke up, they begged David to join them outside in the snow. After breakfast, they rummaged for extra boots and coats for him to wear. They laughed at how big everything looked on him. Soon, the four of them, Emily stayed in to tidy, stepped onto the porch. The winter sun was bright, reflecting off acres of white. The children shrieked with delight, sliding down small hills and building diminutive forts. David felt he was reclaiming a childhood he never had time to relish. Even Loveth warmed up to him as she pelted him with snowballs. The morning passed in laughter. But when plows rumbled in the distance, David tensed. He realized the roads would soon be open. The next stage of his life awaited him, as well as responsibilities that had not stopped simply because he was trapped by a storm. After lunch, his driver contacted him, letting him know a route had opened. Though David felt relief that the crisis was over, he also felt a pang of sorrow at the thought of leaving. The triplets sensed something was shifting and grew anxious. He could see it in their eyes. David and Emily sat on the couch, side by side. He asked if he might return soon. She offered a small smile, admitting that he was always welcome, but that these changes should not confuse the children. He needed to be consistent. David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. For all his billions, he felt powerless in this moment. But he vowed to prove himself. He told Emily he would arrange for them to visit him, or he would come back here with supplies, possibly even better insulation for the cabin or more reliable transportation for them. Emily nodded, though the real challenge lay ahead. Did she trust him enough to let him into their little world permanently? She gave him her phone number, a real connection this time, and promised she would answer. David rose, gathering the borrowed coat. The children gathered around him, their three inquisitive faces looking up. He knelt to give them quick hugs. Lily squeezed his neck tight. Logan asked if David would come back to play again. Loveth clung to his leg. He promised yes, he would come back. Outside, he could hear the roar of the waiting car. Snow crunched underfoot as he made his way to the porch, Emily walking alongside him. In the doorway, for just a moment, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. She thanked him for the help with the children and for trying to do the right thing now. He covered her hand with his, offering a lingering look, unsure what the future held. Then he stepped off the porch and climbed into the car that would return him to his private jet and the life he had known. They drove away slowly. David watched the small cabin recede in the rearview mirror, the triplets waving from the window. He sank back into the leather seat, mind turning with possibilities. He had never felt more determined or more scared. He needed to maintain his business empire, but also to become the father these children deserved. The question haunted him. Would he be able to balance these worlds, or would one demand force him to abandon the other? As the car finally reached the main road, he conjured images of Lily, Logan, and Loveth. He thought of Emily, her bravery and her kindness in saving him from the storm. Above all, he thought of how a life once defined by success and power now seemed woefully incomplete without them. The storm that trapped him had also freed something within him, a yearning to be a better man. A day later, David was back in his towering office building, swirling a cup of coffee, staring out through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city skyline stretched out in all directions, a testament to his achievements. Yet the memory of Emily's humble cabin and the 3 pairs of bright, curious eyes loomed larger than any skyscraper. He asked his assistant to clear his calendar for the upcoming weekend. He told them he had personal matters to attend to, matters that could not be delayed. That evening, before leaving the office, David made a few phone calls to local property developers. He also called a discreet philanthropic organization, hinting at a project near Emily's region, something that might bring resources and better infrastructure without drawing too much attention. He was determined that Emily would not struggle alone. He envisioned better schools, better hospitals for his children, but done in a way that respected Emily's chosen life. As he closed his laptop, ready to head home, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a picture message, a sweet snapshot of Lily, Logan, and Loveth waving from the cabin door. He realized Emily must have found the courage to reach out, to extend a piece of their life to him. He felt his chest tighten with emotion. The possibility that he might earn a place in their world filled him with hope. Yet that very moment, as he prepared to lock his office, the lights flickering overhead, he received an urgent email from a business partner in Europe. Something major threatened one of his largest deals. The potential loss of millions of dollars hung in the balance. For a fleeting instant, the old David might have jumped into action, working through the night to save the deal. But now he hesitated. His mind flew to the children, to Emily. He felt time slow, consumed by the question, which path do I choose? And how could he manage both? He stared at the email, tension building. Then he clicked it open. The details spelled out a crisis that demanded immediate attention. David's heart pounded, a conflict between his old identity and the promise he'd made to be a present father. He sat down again at his desk, eyes darting from the phone with the children's photo to the email's ominous instructions. A swirl of dread and resolve overcame him. He wondered if life was about to turn upside down once more. He typed a response, his fingers trembling over the keyboard, not sure whether to push aside his fatherly duties or to risk millions of dollars. The memory of Emily's kind eyes and the children's laughter echoed in his mind, urging him to make a choice that might alter the course of everything. A single tear threatened to slip down his cheek as he hovered over the send button. His phone buzzed again. Another picture from Emily came through, Loveth holding up a drawing of a tall building that looked suspiciously like David's headquarters, with a little heart drawn inside. The message read, "We miss you already." David's soul wavered. He had seldom felt so vulnerable or torn. Slowly, he glanced back at the email subject line labeled urgent. Immediate action required. There, in that high-tech office with the city's lights twinkling through the large windows, David realized that no matter what happened next, his life would never be the same. The snowstorm might have cleared outside, but a new storm brewed within his heart, forcing him to confront the legacy he truly wished to leave. As he stared at the phone screen, the tension nearly unbearable, David pressed his lips together. He knew he had to decide, fatherhood or business, or perhaps a way to merge both. Yet every second that passed tightened the knot in his chest. A beat of silence stretched across the office. The hum of electricity lingered in the air. David braced himself, eyes locked on the phone, recalling Emily's warm cabin and the triplets' trusting eyes. And in that stillness, right before he made his choice, a flash of fear rippled through him. What if I fail them all? His gaze flicked from the photo to the email and back again. He raised a trembling hand to the keyboard, about to choose his path, and at that precise moment, the lights in the office flickered one last time. Then everything went dark. David's phone's screen glowed faintly in the sudden darkness of his office. The only light in the room came from a nearby emergency panel and the city below, faintly visible through the vast windows. The urgent email blinked at him, demanding a quick response. On his phone, the picture of Lily, Logan, and Loveth, holding up their little artwork, dared him to remember who he was now. He froze for a moment, hardly breathing. With the power out, the quiet hum of electronics vanished. It felt as if time itself had stopped, trapping David in that single, charged instant. Outside, the distant honking of horns drifted up from the streets. Inside, he could hear his own heartbeat. The hush pressed on him like a final test, forcing him to act without the usual comforts of blinking screens and bustling assistants. He realized now that the biggest question was not about money or success, but about living with himself in the days to come. David set his phone on the dark mahogany desk. He tapped a few keys on his laptop, but it showed only a powerless black screen. A wave of anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, but he fought it down. He had built his entire life on swift choices, decisions that were rational, often beneficial, and always aimed at crushing any competition. This time, though, everything was different. The crisis from Europe could cost him millions of dollars. In the past, that possibility would have sent him into an all-night battle to rescue the deal. Now, however, he found himself unmoved by anything but the memory of his children's laughter, the way Emily's eyes had looked under the glow of the cabin's fireplace, and how Lily's small hand had felt gripping his. Carefully, David reached for his phone once more. He scrolled his contacts and clicked open Emily's new number. His thumb hovered over the call button. If he heard her voice, he knew there would be no turning back. Across the office, through the windows, he noticed the first lights flicker back on in a nearby building. Most of the city still lay in swirling darkness, but the faint glow reminded him that the world would keep turning, with or without him at the helm of his company's empire. He pressed the call button. On the second ring, Emily answered with a short hello. The children's excited chatter echoed faintly in the background, and David's heart lurched. He opened his mouth, unsure of exactly what to say. Finally, he spoke softly, his voice cracking, words tumbling out with surprising honesty. He told her he wasn't going to solve every business crisis tonight. Instead, he was coming back if she would allow it. He wanted to be part of the children's lives, to attend their school events, to watch them grow, to tuck them into bed if they woke crying in the night. He wanted to be the father they deserved, no matter the cost. His words spilled out, jumbled but sincere. On the other end of the line, Emily said nothing for a moment. The children's laughter from another room fluttered through the speaker. Then Emily's breath hitched, and she simply told him that they were all waiting, whenever he was ready. It was an answer that both calmed him and rattled him. He realized it would take work, more than anything he had ever done in a boardroom. When the lights came back on in his office, David ended the call and found his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the city glistened with renewed brightness, neon signs flickering in the night. The urgent email from Europe still needed an answer. With a steel-like resolve, David sat down again, jotted a quick note. Please assign my deputy to handle this matter. I will be unavailable for the next few days. He paused, then added something he had never typed before. Family matters require my full attention. He pressed send, ignoring the pulse of adrenaline that usually pushed him to dive back into the business storm. For the first time, he was certain the world could spin without him for a little while. Another surge of relief washed over him, followed by a murmur of something like fear. He was risking everything he once held sacred as a billionaire: prestige, status, and that coveted seat at any table he desired. But as he left his office, stepping into the corridor's emergency lights, his mind was filled with a different vision. Lily's bright grin, Logan's proud holding of his toy truck, Lovitha's shy gaze, and Emily's gentle smile in the hearth's glow. His assistant stood at the door, phone in hand, looking flustered. Usually, David would have barked an order or asked for immediate updates. But now, he simply told her he had to go. She nodded, sensing the urgency, but also noticing an unfamiliar softness in his eyes. He gave brief instructions for the management team to coordinate without him. Then he hurried toward the elevator, grabbed his coat from the stand, and rushed out into the cold. The sidewalk's slick pavement reminded him of the storm that had changed his life. All the way to the airport, David felt a swirl of emotions. He sat in the back seat, scanning through photos on his phone that Emily had sent after they parted. The triplets building a small snowman, the cabin's front porch decorated with children's boots, Emily tucked under a blanket reading a story to the kids. Each image was a reminder of the life he could have missed forever. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, probably noticing David's unusual silence. But David was too consumed by a rush of excitement, nerves, and gratitude to explain much. At the private jet terminal, the crew awaited him, eyes wide at the sudden request to depart so soon after his last flight. He boarded without hesitation. This time, he barely glanced at the plush interior or the many amenities that usually made his travels comfortable. Instead, he kept checking his watch, anxious to return to the place he had just left. The engines roared to life. He told the pilot his destination was the same small airfield, the one where the storm had first trapped him, including all its remote roads and simple diner. During the flight, David fought waves of doubt. What if the children resented him for vanishing before they even knew him? What if Emily's patient acceptance gave way to anger once the shock wore off? But in the end, he decided the only thing that mattered was trying. No matter his fears, these were his children. He had to be there for them. As for business, someone else could finalize that crucial deal. He could recoup lost money, but he could never reclaim lost years with family. The jet landed near midnight. David stepped onto the tarmac, the biting cold wind snapping at his coat. Icy flakes danced in the air, but it was nothing like the devastating blizzard of days before. A single airport car waited, arranged by his staff. Inside, the driver gave him a quizzical look. David gave the address of a small inn near Emily's cabin. He didn't want to startle the family by arriving at such a late hour. His heart pounded with excitement, but he also wanted to show respect for Emily's boundaries. The drive through the snowy roads felt both familiar and surreal. This was the same path that had once made him slip off track, leading him straight into Emily's life again. A bright moon hovered over the snowy hills, illuminating rows of pine trees with a silver sheen. The driver, cautious of the ice, moved slowly. David found himself happy to see every bend, every row of fence glinting under a frosty glow. They arrived at the Modest Inn just past 1 a.m. David politely thanked the driver and carried his small suitcase inside. A sleepy employee checked him in with some confusion, remarking politely on the late hour. David stepped into the basic room, turned on the light, and gazed around the unadorned space. Some part of him felt comforted by its simplicity. The best night's sleep he'd had in years was only a few gestures away. Setting his phone on the side table, he collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to think further. He allowed his eyes to drift shut, lulled by the clean scent of mountain air seeping in around the windowsill. At first light, David awoke to a text. "The kids are coloring pictures right now. They hope you come soon." He read the message 3 times, a grin crossing his face. Emily had no idea that he was already in town. He sent a quick reply, "I'm nearby. May I visit?" A short moment later, her answer came, "Yes. You're welcome anytime." In less than an hour, with a hastily eaten breakfast, David found himself riding along the familiar road, up the gentle slope that led to Emily's cabin. Sunlight spilled over the snow, and the last vestiges of the storm lay piled in sparkling drifts. When he spotted her truck outside the cabin, that same flutter of hope rose in his chest. He was no longer stuck in a storm. He came on purpose. This was his active choice. As he climbed out of the car, Lily, Logan, and Loveth tumbled onto the porch, bounding through the remaining snow piles in their brightly colored jackets. Their laughter filled the crisp air. Lily called out that they had hot cocoa waiting. Logan held up a picture he drew of a big city building next to a tiny cabin, joined by a long winding road. Loveth clung to her teddy bear, beaming softly in David's direction. In that single instant, David realized no boardroom victory could compare to the warmth of seeing his children run toward him, thrilled he was here. Emily stood in the doorway, arms folded, her breath forming small clouds around her face. She watched the scene, looking both happy and uncertain. David approached her, heart thudding, his expensive business shoes crunching on the loose snow. He felt a small wave of awkwardness, not sure what to say. The children chattered around him, tugging at his coat sleeves, but He kept his gaze on Emily, searching her eyes. She gave a slight nod, and her lips curved into a soft smile. He whispered that he came back for them. For all of them. She pressed her hand to his arm in acknowledgement, the weight of old wounds and new hope hanging between them. He knew it would take more than grand gestures or money to fix the lost years. It would require patience, honesty, and the willingness to accept that not everything could be controlled through business strategies. But David was ready. He told Emily as much, in a voice laced with both fear and resolution. Inside the cabin, the children proudly showed David their drawings, some doodles of the mountains, some of a bright sun with smiley faces, and a few wild fantasies of rocket ships and dragons. Loveth's picture, crayon sketched with heartfelt care, had 4 figures, a mother, a father, and 2 siblings. In the corner, there was a tiny teddy bear. She pointed to each shape, naming them with a giggle. David's throat tightened with emotion. This was his real treasure, more valuable than all the deals he had ever closed. Emily guided David to the kitchen, where a pot of hot cocoa simmered and the sweet smell of sugar wafted around them. The children ran ahead, jostling for seats at the small wooden table. Over the whispered clinks of cups and the rustle of jackets, David explained to Emily that he had sent instructions for someone else to handle the European crisis. He did not know how his board of directors would react, but for now, that did not matter. He would be here, helping Lily, Logan, and Loveth make snow angels if they wanted. He would read them bedtime stories and make up for every lost memory he could. Emily appeared relieved, but also cautious. Life had taught her that people can leave just as easily as they show up. But David promised he would stay. That did not mean he would fix everything instantly, or that mistakes wouldn't happen. But he would be a father, a real one, not merely in name. He offered to begin by making dinner or helping out with errands. Emily laughed quietly, explaining that it might take time before he mastered a rural grocery run in the snow. Still, a gentle confidence lit her face. She was willing to let him try. Later, as twilight came and the children settled in front of the fireplace with picture books, David slipped outside to gather more firewood. Each breath made small clouds in the evening air, and the snow beneath his feet squeaked in sub-zero temperatures. Pausing, he looked back through the window at the warm glow inside. 3 small heads leaned against Emily as she read, each child's eyes fixed on the pages. The silhouettes against the firelight struck him as the most precious image he had ever seen. Earlier in his life, the sight of that fluttering pipeline of business emails and frantic phone calls would have called him away. But now, he stood in the snow and felt only a profound sense of belonging. No urgent summons could overshadow this moment. In the stillness, he realized that although he had nearly lost them, fate had given him a second chance. The storm had forced him off the road and onto a path that led to his true wealth. That night, he tucked Lily into bed when she asked for more blankets. He picked up Logan's toy trucks and helped arrange them by size, just how Logan preferred. And in Loveth's room, he found her drifted off to sleep with her teddy bear hugging her face. He left a little night light on for her. Then, in the hush of the hallway, he found Emily watching from the shadowy corridor. Tears shone in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. David took a step closer, aware that so much remained unspoken. She reached for his hand, squeezing it with a subtle strength he remembered from years ago. They returned to the living room, where the embers from the fireplace were low. David settled near the remaining warmth, and Emily sat close. Gazing at the faint glow of firelight dancing across the walls, he whispered that he was resigning from certain duties at the company. He still owned much of it, but he planned to install a new CEO to handle the daily battles. He would accept the losses that might occur. He told her calmly that his life couldn't be about endless profit anymore. He wanted to build a future for his children, help them do crafts, drive them to school, teach them about responsibility, and watch them chase their dreams. Emily inhaled slowly, absorbing his words. She left his side briefly, rummaged in a small wooden box near the bookcase, then returned. She handed him a photograph he had never seen before, a younger Emily, pregnant, sitting on this very porch, smiling softly despite the fear in her eyes. A lump rose in David's throat. He felt pained at how alone she must have been. Yet here was proof that she had faced it with the same quiet resolve she now showed. He vowed, silently, that she would never have to face challenges alone again. In the days that followed, David experienced a strange peace. The business phone calls that used to control his life now came second. He even shut off his phone entirely at certain times, telling the board it wasn't up for debate. Some were shocked or furious, but eventually they accepted it. Whenever guilt threatened to climb his spine, he remembered Lily's bright laugh, Logan's thoughtful questions, or Lovetha's gentle smile. Compared to that, everything else seemed small. Email after email about lost deals or delayed expansion stacked up, but David found he could breathe freely for the first time in years. One evening, a week or so after he returned, he sat outside the cabin with Emily, both of them wrapped in thick blankets as the children slept inside. The stars glimmered above, reflected in the crisp white snow. A breeze rustled the pine branches, scattering tiny clumps of snow to the ground. David held Emily's hand, feeling more like a real person than he ever had. They spoke quietly of the future, maybe a bigger house with enough room for the children to each have their own space, or perhaps a small extension to the cabin so they could stay close to the land the triplets called home. He set aside any fear he had about the European crisis, his lost deals, or the finances that once ruled his every waking minute. Just because he was a billionaire did not mean he had to keep chasing more. He thought of Lily, Logan, and Loveth, how they found such joy in the simplest things, drawing pictures, building snow forts, sipping hot cocoa after playing outside. He realized they had already taught him more about genuine happiness than all his wealth ever had. The hush of the pine forest surrounded them. Finally, Emily rested her head against David's shoulder. It was not a dramatic moment of triumph or a fling of passion. It was something far more important, a peaceful acceptance that they were all here now, stepping toward a new life. David carefully wrapped an arm around her, the warmth between them enough to keep the winter cold at bay. For the first time in as long as he could recall, he felt certain about his path. Under the star-filled sky, David closed his eyes. He pictured the bright city he once commanded from those mirrored towers. Then he let that image fade, replaced by the simple glow of the cabin windows and the knowledge that inside slept the children who needed him. He had sacrificed enough moments already. He would not lose any more. With that resolve, David realized he had finally chosen. There would be no going back. He was a father first, a billionaire second, and for once, he knew that was the surest investment of his life.